Well, I wonder why some parables get explicit explanations and others don't. Last week we had the parable of the sower, and Jesus says directly that they are the ones doing the planting and gives corresponding real-life anecdotes for every type of soil. But I think that text and this gospel today may be the only ones in all of Matthew to receive such thorough treatment. You are on your own for figuring out the parable of the mustard seed. I think that you have that one. It makes me wonder, what is the difference between a parable and a fable, anyhow? Perhaps some of the literary aficionados among us can help me delineate, but to me, when that explanation, that interpretation gets spelled out, it starts to feel a little bit more like the ant and the grasshopper, or Anansi the spider, or Chufki the rabbit, and other trickster tales. Perhaps they don't need to be categorically different, parables and fables. Maybe Jesus, as someone of a culture rich in storytelling, is simply utilizing the dialect that is already growing there, bearing sacred fruit even within the inelegant folk traditions of field hands and sailors. This parable gets an explanation, though, at least in part, because the disciples ask for one. They hear a few other parables alongside the large crowd gathered there, but then pull Jesus aside and say, "We would like to circle back to the whole wheat and weeds thing." Perhaps it gets added reflection because this parable feels more complex than average. Perhaps because it's more relatable, closer to home than average. Those are often the tricky ones for each of us. This is a story about doing the right things, or doing things right, and still having problems pop up. This is a story of the difficulty in sorting between good and bad sometimes. This is a story of something hollow presenting itself as something helpful. Because that was the problem with these weeds. They look just like the wheat, which holds the goodness of grain and can be used for nourishing bread, but inside, it's just empty. And that's the thing about invasive species, is that they often are particularly adapted at camouflage. Still, the weed can lure you into spending all kinds of energy on it, hoping that it will bloom, while ultimately providing nothing in return. And this, Jesus says, is a devilish doing. Another word for devil is deceiver, or that which deceives. It may be less a singular character that makes trouble, but the many weavers and ways that so tangles into the mix. Growing up, my pastor presented us with the definition of sin as evil which masquerades as good. That was one possible way of understanding sin, as evil which masquerades as good. And it makes me think of proclamations of peace that are really just marketable illusions of control. The shallow or hollow version of things that are good and life-giving. I was trying to research this, and it was either MLK or Desmond Tutu that may have originally said that peace is not the absence of conflict, right, but the presence of justice. That's the difference between hollow peace and fruitful peace. But isn't that such a familiar reality? The best stuff of life and the trials of it, all growing in the same field. the nourishing parts and the draining parts, all mixed in together. In the parable, the slaves who were assigned to work this field understand their task to be raising a crop that will bring the largest possible harvest. And best practices in farming say you pick one thing per field and do it well. And this insistence on purity and absolutes is the first thing to bring conflict. It starts the finger pointing and blame. Didn't you sow good seed? They accuse. But this would have them destroy the good in the name of perfect. Trying to get rid of this complexity now might seem to move them closer to their goal, their hope, but it would be like cutting off your nose to spite your face. You would get nothing from demanding a closed fist of certainty versus the vulnerable and more fruitful and complex nature of mystery. This demand is a powerful and pervasive one, though. Tribalism on the left and right insists that there is one way to see the world, one way to be in it, and you better stay in line, toe that line, or get blasted. If you've ever been on Facebook, you know. And the church can be the same way, proclaiming that there is one right way to understand and interact with God. We can all too easily create a kind of theological police state to enforce that singular view. Friend groups and families may label and ostracize anyone who doesn't comply with their chosen standard of behavior. It starts early, right? I remember in preschool, my daughter experiencing friends who said, well, if you're friends with them, you can't be friends with us. There is one way to do this. And often, it isn't presented or said out loud or explicitly like that. Often, it is presented in a softer husk of virtue and even kindness. But the effect remains the same. We have been convinced that this is the best way to protect goodness, to sort it out. But this story suggests that that is a recipe for mutual destruction. Growing up here in the South, we have a saying, it'll all come out in the wash. Meaning, in the end, things have a way of resolving themselves. It's a soothing reminder that everything doesn't have to be and often cannot be spotless all the time or resolved immediately. It helps set a longer-term perspective on things. And I believe that's true, but I also know that that idea can get abused to allow toxic ways to continue unchecked. So I'm not sure that this is Jesus proclaiming, why can't we all just get along? I'm not convinced that this is a teaching to just let everything roll off your back and go along to get along. Because that feels hollow in its own way too. Perhaps it is more an invitation to ask ourselves, to wrestle. How do good things grow even in the presence of hurt and hostility? How do we navigate care and complexity? I think we experience this in our family dynamics, our workplaces, our faith communities, our own roles as parent or caregiver or partner. We wrestle with it within ourselves as we grow and move in our understandings of ourselves, our worth, and our purpose. How do we love and nurture ourselves even when we are a tangled mess? How do we support others in that process? We tend to this field of complicated beauty all the time, in big ways and smaller ways. We ask ourselves these big questions about the small particularities of life. Can we still enjoy Harry Potter with its magic and wonder and friendship without enabling its author, J.K. Rowling, and her transphobia that she expresses? Can we raise the alarm of climate change and still use our fossil-fueled cars to go on road trips for the summer? Honoring and finding a way through the tangle is one of the reasons I enjoyed the new Barbie movie so much. And neither Mattel nor Greta Gerwig paid me to say this, but it acknowledges and pokes fun at the unattainable and unnatural extremes of a woman whose feet are always arched even when they're not wearing shoes, and whose story is seemingly perfect. It doesn't shy away from the damage that it can and has caused to both men and women and the relationships between. But it also shows that there is still room for holding on to the way that this small piece of plastic has given generations a way to dream and explore identity and relationships and practice creating whole worlds. As the blessed Indigo Girls have offered, perhaps there is more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line. And the less I seek my source from some definitive, the closer I am to find. Thank you, Indigo Girl fans. We can't anticipate or repel every conflict or crisis. We can't root out every challenge or complexity. And perhaps we shouldn't. But we do have some agency in how we understand ourselves and respond, how we will live and grow, how we will tend to each other alongside one another. And in doing so, we can rely on God's promises as we do our best to honor the mixed field we grow in. And even when we stumble or feel more hollow than fruitful, we are grounded in God's grace that can withstand our tangled webs. We are part of a bigger story where the things that hobble us are given to a refiner's fire, not of condemnation, but of transformation. And even as we mourn the small comforts that they gave us in life, we all the more are created to shine. Let it be so. Amen.